What would you do if the sky became your enemy? If the rain, the source of all life, the miracle that coaxes grain from the earth, transformed into a relentless deluge, a deluge that drowns your crops, rots your hopes, and condemns you to a world of mud and hunger? Imagine, close your eyes, feel the cold, a damp, clinging cold that seeps into your bones and never, ever leaves. It doesn't matter how many layers of clothing you wear, no matter how close you huddle to the fire. Listen. Listen to the constant, monotonous, maddening sound of rain drumming on the thatched roof of your hut, day after day, week after week, a drumming that becomes the soundtrack to the end of your world. Smell. It is the sour, rotten scent of the fields. The earth is waterlogged, sick. The wheat, which should be golden and tall, is a black, limp, lifeless mass, decomposing on the stalk. Now, feel the knot in your stomach, an emptiness you know well, the hunger at the end of the day. But this is different. This is an emptiness that will not go away, an emptiness that will soon become a sharp, piercing pain. It is the pain of a world that has run out of bread. This is not apocalyptic fiction. This is not a biblical tale. This was the brutal reality that faced an entire continent. It was the beginning of the end of a world, a climatic cataclysm that history knows as the Great Famine. What you are about to hear is not the story of kings and their distant battles. It is the intimate, desperate chronicle of how civilization falls apart when the food runs out. We are going to descend into the year 1315. We will walk through its flooded fields and silent villages to understand what it was like to live in a time when Europe, literally, devoured itself. To grasp the scale of the disaster, you must first see the Europe of 1314, the year before the catastrophe. It was the High Middle Ages, a world at its peak, stretched taut and ready to snap. Imagine a full Europe, full to the brim. For 300 years, an unusually warm and stable climate, known as the medieval warm period, had allowed for an unprecedented population boom. The population had tripled. Ancient forests had been cleared for new fields. Swamps had been drained. People were farming on marginal lands, on steep hillsides, on poor soils that could barely sustain a crop. Every corner of arable land was being exploited. The system was at the absolute limit of its capacity. There were too many people and too little land. The slightest shock could trigger a collapse. And then, the shock came. The year 1315 was not simply a year of bad weather. It was the starting gun for a drastic climate shift, the beginning of what we now call the Little Ice Age. The spring of that year arrived with a terrifying anomaly. Across northern Europe, from the coasts of Ireland to the plains of Poland, the sun did not rise. Instead, the heavens opened and unleashed a torrential, cold, and constant rain, and it did not stop. The incessant rain caused a cascading failure that attacked every pillar of medieval survival. The grain seeds, the absolute foundation of the diet, rotted in the ground before they could sprout. The few that did were washed away by the rain and cold. The hay for the livestock could not be mowed or dried. The animals, without fodder for the winter, began to die en masse. And perhaps worst of all, a cruel twist of fate. Without sun, the seawater in coastal salt pans would not evaporate. The production of salt, the only means of preserving what little meat was left, plummeted. It was a perfect storm. A coordinated attack by nature on a human system that had already expanded beyond its limits. The house of cards of medieval prosperity was about to come crashing down. What began as a concern in the spring of 1315 transformed into widespread panic by summer. The backbone of medieval life, the grain harvest, had failed. Not partially, totally and utterly. Put yourself in the place of a peasant of that time. You are standing at the edge of your field. But it is not a field. It is a swamp of mud. You see your wheat, an entire year's work, the only hope for feeding your family. It is not golden. It is a blackish, withered mass, bent under the weight of a rain that does not cease. Feel the mud, cold, thick, and sticky, sucking at your worn leather boots with every step. It is the same earth that has fed you your whole life, and now it seems to want to drown you. Listen to the silence. An unnatural, terrifying silence. At this time of year, the fields should be buzzing with the sound of scythes, with the songs of the harvest. Instead, there is nothing, only the patter of the rain. You look towards your barn, and you know it is empty. To understand the terror of that empty barn, you must understand the economy of bread. Grain was not just another food, it was everything. It was bread. It was beer. It was fodder for the animals. It was the currency with which you paid your taxes to the Lord. With the harvest annihilated, prices skyrocketed to unimaginable levels. The chronicles of the time are unanimous. They report increases of 300, 500, even 800% in the price of wheat in a matter of months. The wealthy, the feudal lords, the monasteries, with their reserves and their gold, bought and hoarded everything they could find. But you, the peasant living from harvest to harvest, were left with nothing overnight. And then, your family faces an impossible decision, the most desperate decision. You look at the few seeds you had saved for next year's planting. They are your only hope for the future. But your children are crying with hunger now, and you make the choice. You grind the seeds of the future to make one last, bitter loaf of bread for the present. It is an act of slow-motion suicide. It is the choice between starving now or guaranteeing starvation in a year's time. It is the sound of hope being crushed in a mortar. Famine is not an equalizer. It does not unite people in suffering. It shatters them. It destroys the most basic social bonds, turning neighbors into enemies and compassion into a luxury no one can afford. Imagine a medieval city in the winter of 1316. The streets, normally bustling, are now a theater of horror. They are filled with people from the countryside who have fled their useless lands in search of something, anything. They are emaciated specters, their skin stretched tight over their bones, their bellies swollen from malnutrition. Listen to the sharp, constant crying of children, a sound that pierces your soul. Feel the fear in people's eyes. No one looks at anyone. Those who still have some food bolt their doors, board up their windows. Every stranger is a threat. Every knock on the door is a cause for panic. Smell the air. It is no longer the smell of burning wood and baking bread. It is the sickly, sweet, nauseating smell of disease and death, beginning to hang like an invisible fog. Law and order, that thin veneer of civilization, disintegrates. Crime explodes. The theft of a crust of bread is paid for with one's life. Gangs raid the roads, plunder the lords' granaries. The feudal lords themselves are powerless. How can they maintain order if they cannot feed their own soldiers? The chronicles tell us terrible stories. Parents abandoning their children in the woods, unable to feed them, hoping that someone will find them or that death will be swift. These are not fables. They are the dark, real origin of tales like Hansel and Gretel. The crisis reaches the very top of power. King Edward II of England, on a journey through his kingdom, is publicly humiliated. His own entourage cannot find bread to buy in a town. The King of England, God's anointed, goes hungry like a commoner. But the deepest impact is the loss of trust. The fundamental unit of medieval society, the village, shatters into 1,000 pieces. The question, who ate today, becomes a matter of life and death, a source of suspicion and hatred. Your neighbor, with whom you have celebrated feasts and shared grief, is no longer your friend. He is your competitor in the struggle for survival, and in that struggle, there are no rules. To comprehend the depth of suffering, we must pause and look not just at society, but at the human body. What does starvation do to a person? It is a process of self-destruction, slow and methodical. First, the body consumes its fat reserves. Then, when the fat is gone, it begins to consume the muscles. Arms and legs become thin as sticks. The face becomes hollow. The immune system completely collapses. The body has no energy to defend itself. Diseases that would normally not be fatal become death sentences. Pneumonia, dysentery, typhus spread like wildfire through a weakened and crowded population. Millions die, not from hunger directly, but from the diseases that hunger invites in. But there was an added horror, a hell within a hell. With the good grain gone, desperate people ate anything, including the rye grains that had survived but were infected with a dark, purplish mold called claviceps purpurea, or ergot. Eating this infected grain caused a terrible disease, ergotism, known in the Middle Ages as St. Anthony's fire. It caused vivid and terrifying hallucinations, violent convulsions, and an unbearable burning sensation in the limbs, as if they were being consumed by an invisible fire. Then came the gangrene. Blood flow to the hands and feet was cut off. The limbs turned black, withered, and literally fell off. Imagine the horror of watching your own body rot while you are still alive. At the deepest point of despair, when the granaries were empty, the animals dead, and the roots of the trees already eaten, humanity faced its darkest frontier. When there is nothing left to eat, man turns to the last taboo, the most unthinkable act of survival: cannibalism. The narration here must change. It becomes slower, more whispered. Imagine the fear in a small village in the winter of 1317. Travelers passing through the nearby forest simply disappear. Listen to the stories, told in low voices by the fire. Stories about freshly dug graves appearing empty in the morning, about smoke rising from the chimneys of houses where, supposedly, there is nothing left to cook. Visualize the most terrible scene: a prisoner, locked in a dark dungeon, starving to death. Next to him lies the corpse of his cellmate, and suddenly, he looks at it in a new way, not as a man, but as the meat he needs to survive one more day. Direct archaeological evidence is scarce, but the chronicles of the time, from Ireland to England and the Holy Roman Empire, are filled with chilling accounts. They speak of men who kill and devour their own children, of innkeepers who murder their guests to sell their flesh, of prisoners who eat the newcomers in their cells. We must be clear, it was not a widespread practice. It was the act of the most extreme horror, the last resort of those who had lost all hope and all humanity. But the psychological impact was immense. What does it mean to live in a world where your neighbor, in his desperation, might see you not as a person, but as food? It is the final collapse. It is the point at which the definition of being human dissolves into the animal need to survive. In the midst of this earthly apocalypse, where was God? Where was the church, the most powerful institution in the medieval world? Put yourself in the shoes of a priest in a small parish. Your parishioners, your flock, come to you. Their faces are masks of hunger and despair. They ask you, "Why, Father? Why is God doing this to us?" You do what you have been taught. You lead processions in the incessant rain, barefoot in the mud. You organize mass fasts among people who are already starving to death. You lead endless prayers, begging every saint in heaven to intercede. But the rain does not stop. The hunger worsens. Your prayers seem empty, bouncing off a leaden sky. Doubt and guilt begin to eat away at you. How do you explain this? Is it the wrath of God for the people's sins, as the bishops preach? If so, why do innocent children die? Is it the apocalypse, the end of times foretold in the scriptures? The authority of the church, built on the promise of being the intermediary between God and man, is deeply and permanently damaged. Its spiritual tools, prayer, penance, mass, are proven powerless against a natural catastrophe. This crisis of faith did not overthrow the church, but it planted seeds of doubt and skepticism in the European mind. The absolute certainty that had defined the Middle Ages began to crack. Eventually, in the summer of 1317, the rain stopped. The weather began to stabilize. The harvests, slowly, returned. But the Great Famine did not end. It left a deep, festering scar on the psyche and demography of Europe. Imagine the landscape of a post-famine Europe. Around 1322, you see entire villages that have vanished, their huts collapsed and overgrown with weeds. You see fertile fields abandoned, reclaimed by the forest, because there is no one left to cultivate them. You see a generation of surviving children. They are shorter, weaker. Their bodies, deprived of nutrition in their growing years, are permanently damaged. Their health is fragile. You hear a strange silence. The bustle of an overpopulated Europe has been replaced by the emptiness left by the dead. The numbers are staggering. It is estimated that between 10% and 25% of the population of Northern Europe died between 1315 and 1322. Millions of people. The social structure was shaken to its foundations. Trust in the institutions that were supposed to protect the people, the nobility and the church, was forever corroded, and the trauma remained. An intergenerational trauma. The people who survived those years would never look at the sky the same way again. Every storm cloud would bring back a memory of fear. The famine became part of their folklore, their cautionary tales. The memory of a time when the sky tried to kill them was etched into their cultural DNA. The Great Famine did not cause the Black Death, but it prepared the ground for it. It acted as the first brutal reaper in a two-act play of death. Transport yourself now to the year 1347. Imagine a port in southern Europe. There is a man on the docks, in his late 30s. He is a survivor of the famine. He was a child when it happened. He watches a Genoese ship arriving from the east. This man is harder, more cynical than his parents. Generation. He has seen the end of the world once, but his body never fully recovered from the malnutrition of his childhood. The Black Death, which arrived on those ships, would have been devastating under any circumstances. But the Great Famine ensured that the plague found a perfectly vulnerable Europe. The plague found a population with immune systems already compromised by a generation of poor nutrition. It found weakened social structures, with a ruling class whose authority had already been questioned. It found a population whose faith in God and the Church had already been shaken to its core. The famine was the body blow. The plague was the knockout punch. Imagine the tragic fate of that generation. They were born at the height of medieval optimism, in a world that seemed full of possibilities, and in the course of their lives, they experienced the apocalypse, not once, but twice. Imagine a survivor of the famine in the year 1325. The sun is shining again, the fields are green, and life, somehow, goes on. But he does not smile. He looks at his children, smaller and more fragile than they should be. He looks at his neighbors with a distrust that will never fully disappear. He hears the wind blow through the trees and, for a moment, he thinks he hears the sound of the endless rain. He survived, yes, but a part of him, and a part of his world, starved to death in those dark years. The Great Famine of 1315 is a terrifying reminder of our fundamental fragility. It teaches us that our civilization, with all its laws, its beliefs, and its power structures, is only a few failed harvests away from absolute chaos. It was a climate catastrophe that not only killed millions, but broke the psychological backbone of the Middle Ages, proving that the most dangerous threat does not always come from armies and kings, but sometimes from the sky itself. After seeing how medieval society fell apart, what do you think was the worst consequence of the Great Famine? The death of millions from starvation, or the loss of faith and trust among the people who survived? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this journey into the depths of history has impacted you, subscribe to this channel. Here, we don't just tell history, we feel its weight.